Hello, folks. Hope you are doing well. Thanks for joining me here for the second week of our study of the book of Genesis. Last week we did just a little introduction to the book, and then we looked at chapter 1. So today we'll take a look at chapters 2 and 3. And I'm going to encourage you to just go ahead and pause the video now and read those chapters. It should only take you a couple of minutes. And then come back to the video when you're done. Okay, so last week we talked about how Genesis and the Torah as a whole is a compendium of stories that underwent a number of revisions and additions. One of the results of this, which may not be clear on first glance to kind of the casual reader, is that there's actually two completely separate and distinct creation narratives or creation myths. One goes from Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, to the first part of chapter 2, verse 4, and the other from 2:4b really all the way to the end of chapter 3. So these two stories are written by different people, which we know because they use different vocabulary, including different names for God. There's also some pretty significant differences in the narratives. For instance, in the Genesis 1 story, human beings who were never given names in that story are created last, whereas in the Genesis 2 story, from which we get the names Adam and Eve, Adam comes first because you can't have vegetation with no one to work the land, and the animals are created to be Adam's partners in caring for the garden, but none of them turns out to be a suitable partner, so God forms Eve from Adam's rib. Remember, though, that we're dealing with mythology here, not history or science. So it doesn't really matter that the stories don't line up in terms of their descriptive details. What's fascinating, though, is that in terms of how they explore the questions about the nature and the destiny of humanity, and about the meaning of the universe, these stories are remarkably well aligned. So let me give you just one example. Remember that in Genesis 1, we started with deep, dark waters, right? Darkness covered the face of the deep while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. But in Genesis 2, we start not with deep waters, but an arid desert. I'll read you a bit. In that day, the Lord God made the earth and the heavens, when no plant of the field was yet in the earth, and no herb of the field had yet sprung up, for the Lord God had not caused it to rain upon the earth. So the images are almost opposites, but the mythic function, I think, is the same. Both are symbols of chaotic inhospitality, a place where human beings and all of God's creation cannot flourish. So, different images, same function. Okay, but here's an even better example. In chapter 1, we said that the point the author was trying to make to a people who, remember, were in exile and thus cut off from their temple was that all of God's creation is a temple. Now, what's the point of a temple? Well, the center of the temple is where God dwells. So the temple is the center of all life and energy and meaning. And from the temple, the life-giving energy of God, as it were, flows out to the rest of the world. So what do we have in Genesis 2? Well, we have a garden, at the center of which is a tree of life, right? This is good stuff. And 4 rivers flow out from that center point. The center of life and energy and meaning flowing out to the whole world. Different image, same function. Okay, so we started with a dusty desert, and now we've got rivers, where there's dust and there's water and there's clay. So God, who's far more anthropomorphized in this second creation myth than in the first one, digs up some of the clay to mold a statue. Then, did you catch this? God breathes into and transforms it from rock-hard clay into a living, breathing human being. Now, this might seem a little weird to us, but the first hearers of this text would have known exactly what was going on. Interestingly, this actually likely mimics an idol-making practice that was common throughout the ancient Near East. They would construct statues of gods from wood or metal or clay, And then, in a ceremony referred to as the opening of the mouth, they would ritually breathe into the statues, marking the moment that sacramentally they became living, breathing gods. That's why you frequently hear the Hebrew prophets demeaning the idols of other religions by claiming that they have no breath in them. Here's a line from the prophet Habakkuk. He says, "What use is an idol once its maker has shaped it, a cast image, a teacher of lies? For its maker trusts in what has been made, though the product is only an idol that cannot speak. Alas, for you who say to the wood, 'Wake up,' to the silent stone, 'Rouse yourself.' Can it teach? See, it is gold and silver plated, and there is no breath in it at all." See, but the crazy thing is that in this story, in Genesis 2, God is making an idol of himself. In fact, if you go read the injunction against making graven images in the Ten Commandments, it echoes the language of a passage that we glossed over in last week's study of Genesis 1 narrative, where God deems to make human beings in their own image. That's to say, the reason that you're not supposed to make idols of the God of Israel is that the idols of that God have already been created and you are one of them. This is also priestly language. It's the priest who is the image and the representative of God. The priest disseminates God's life-giving energy into the world. And why shouldn't there be priestly language here, right? In the creation myth of Genesis 2 and 3, we see gardeners partnering with God to ensure the flourishing of this garden creation. But in the creation myth of Genesis 1, we already saw that the whole creation is a temple. And what gardeners are to a garden, priests are to a temple. Different image, same function. So, you and I are created to be gardener priests, idols and representatives of God, tasked with cultivating the flourishing of the whole creation by extending to it the life-giving energy of God, around which the whole world centers. Okay, but the tree of life isn't alone at the center of this garden. There's also a tree that represents seizing the power to know and to name for oneself what is good and bad. Notice how in Genesis 1, it is God who names things as good. Remember that liturgical rhythm we talked about? God said, "Let there be," and there was. God saw that it was good, named it, and there was evening and morning. But now it's Eve who names the tree as good for food. She grasps for that uniquely divine authority to name good and bad. Notice that this is the exact opposite of the mind that was in the second Adam, the Messiah, Jesus, who, as the ancient hymn says, though he was the image and likeness of God, did not consider equality with God a thing to be grasped at. This kind of seizure of control to name good and bad for ourselves, to make our own way, ultimately leads to death. First, of the animals whose hides are used to cover their shame, but we see how high the stakes get in the very next chapter when Adam and Eve's son, Cain, flies into a fit of rage after a failed attempt once again to control what God recognizes as good, and he murders his own brother. Now, here's the tragic irony of this whole story. Adam and Eve caused all of this death and destruction by trying to become like God, trying to seize for themselves the authority to name good and bad, when in fact, they already are like God. They are living, breathing idols, divine image bearers, garden priests, tasked with extending the life-giving energy of God to the whole creation. Okay, so here's a challenge for this week. Examine your own heart. Where are the places that you have seized control of the power to name something as good or bad? Maybe you've labeled someone because of their political affiliation or stance on some issue. Maybe you're judging someone because you've decided that you don't approve of their behavior. Maybe it's your attempt to justify to yourself your own patterns of behavior that you know to be destructive. What have you decided to name as good or bad? And how this week can you release those judgments just a little bit and instead be about the work of extending God's life-giving energy to the world? Thanks, friends. I'll catch you next week.